Hey friends, it's Laurie. Thanks so much for stopping by. Today I'm sharing 22 of my favorite gnomes. They're all no-sew. I used mostly Dollar Tree supplies, some recycled wood, and a few things that I had on hand. I hope you have fun crafting with me, so let's get busy. I'm starting my patriotic gnome by using one of the wood cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I removed the hang tag, and with my red acrylic paint, I'm painting the bottom of his legs. Once that's done, I'm then using my white acrylic paint and painting his beard. I'm giving my gnome a real beard, and I'm using this mop head from the Dollar Tree. Using my scissors, I cut off about 14 strands, but you can always use a little more or a little less. Before I permanently attach them, I want to find their placement. For the shorter side pieces of the beard, I'm cutting the strands in half and then lying them in place. Once I have them cut, I'm placing the ends on the top of his painted beard. As I'm adding the strands, I'm tucking one tightly next to the other. When I come to the center, I'm leaving them longer and then just kind of trimming them off where his beard ends. Now that I have all the strands in place, I'm going to turn my gnome around and attach them with my glue gun. As I'm gluing them into place, I continue to line them up next to each other because they do have a tendency to try to move around a bit. If you like gnomes, I have made a variety of different types of gnomes, and I will have that playlist linked below in case you'd like to check it out. Once the beard has cooled and it's attached in place, I'm then going to unravel each of the strands. Now that I'm done, I'm using my scissors and I'm going to trim up the beard and give it a nice shape. And I'm using the wooden beard underneath as my guide to how long and short I want the sides and the bottom. To make my gnome 3D, I'm using a 1-inch wooden knob that I had on hand. It has a flat bottom, but if you don't have any of these, you can always use one of the plastic ping pong balls from the Dollar Tree. Those work great too. I'm painting mine with a coral color, but you can paint yours any color you'd like. When it's dry and to attach it, I'm using my E6000. Once that's added, I'm backing it up with some hot glue, and that just kind of helps hold it in place until the E6000 sets up. I'm making some arms for my gnome, and I'm using some ribbon that I found at Joann Fabrics. It's 1.5 inch, and it was actually 50% off. I measured the ribbon from the gnome's shoulder to the middle of his beard. I then cut it to size and cut a matching piece. To make the gnome's arms, I'm adding some hot glue to the center of one ribbon and then folding in the two sides. And after I made my first one, I then made my second. To attach them, I folded over about 2 inches on the gnome's shoulder and then hot glued the arm into place. I matched the two hands up in the front and then followed the same instructions. I then added on a dot of hot glue and attached the hands together. To make the gnome's hat, I'm using a 2.5 inch wired ribbon that I also picked up at Joann's, and it was half price. I'm placing the ribbon over the gnome's nose and covering the shoulders. And I'm also leaving enough on the back to basically cover it. I'm leaving the ribbon in place and adding a line of hot glue on the gnome's nose and then attaching it. I'm then attaching the two pieces onto the back. I'm now following the same instructions for my next piece, and I'm slightly overlapping the first. If you don't happen to have ribbon on hand, you can always substitute a piece of fabric. Before I add on my next piece, I'm tucking a little polyfill under the ribbon to fill in the open void. And now I'm adding on my second piece of ribbon, slightly overlapping my first, and then attaching it onto the back. And once again, to give the hat a fuller appearance, I tucked a bit of polyfill under the ribbon. And once again, I'm adding my next piece of ribbon. I'm measuring it and cutting it and then attaching it to the hat. Once I had it glued in place, I then once again tucked a tiny piece of polyfill under the ribbon. To add my last piece, I'm going to slightly overlap the top ribbon. This time I'm making a point on the top and then gathering my ribbon and cutting it. I'm making sure to keep it pinched together, and then I'm adding some hot glue and attaching it. I'm adding an accent around my gnome's hat, and I'm using some jute from the Dollar Tree. I added a dot of hot glue to the back of the hat, attached the jute, and then wrapped it around. I wrapped mine around 5 or 6 times. I cut off the excess and attached the end onto the back with my glue gun. I pulled a daisy off of this bunch that I had on hand and then hot glued it onto the center of the jute. To accent my gnome's hands, I'm using one of these sparkly paper stars that I picked up at Joann's. Using my hot glue gun, I attached it over the gnome's hands. I'm also adding on a red and a blue felt star, and I picked this package up at Michael's. They're both self-adhesive, so I just peeled off the back and added them to the silver star. I want to make my gnome a base, so I'm using a wooden heart that I had on hand, and it's thick enough to hold his weight, and I'm painting it with the same red acrylic paint that I used on his legs. While that's drying, I'm putting together the gnome stand, and I'm using 6 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I'm using my glue gun and attaching 2 sets of 3 together. I'm now adding some hot glue to the back of my gnome and attaching the blocks to become the stand. Now that my heart is dry, I'm adding some E6000 to the bottom of the base and some hot glue onto the heart, then attaching the 2 together. The hot glue will help hold it in place until the E6000 sets up. To finish up, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree's American flags, and I'm tucking it over the gnome's arm and into its beard. And with that, this patriotic gnome is ready to celebrate. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below, leaving me a thumbs up, and to all my returning friends, you know I'm always so happy to see you. Getting started, I'm using the bottom half of one of the round gift boxes from the Dollar Tree. I also found these cool socks there, and I'm using one of these to cover the gift box. I placed the sock over the bottom, leaving the top open. You'll need something to weigh down the box. I'm using these leftover glass beads, but you can use some rocks or some rice or anything that you have on hand. When I was done adding my beads, I then tied off the top with an elastic band. For my gnome's beard, I'm using this black palm that came from the Dollar Tree, and just like my first project, I'm removing the hanger. I'm cutting the insides and I'm flattening out the fabric. I'm using my scissors to snip off any of the imperfections, and then I'm cutting it into a rounded beard shape. To attach the beard, I'm placing some hot glue on the back, and I'm making sure to leave a little space at the top so I can place on my nose, and then I'm just pressing it against the body. I painted a white nose just like I did in my other two projects, and using my glue gun, I placed a little bit just under the beard and then popped my nose into place. To turn my gnome into a ladybug, I'm using a ladybug skirt and headband from the Dollar Tree. I removed the antennae and the wings from my headband, and then I hot glued a wing on each side of my gnome. I want to end up with two pieces of fabric just like my first project, so I'm once again taking apart the waistband and the seam on my ladybug skirt. And just like my first project, I'm folding my fabric in half, I'm meeting the two ends, and I'm cutting on the fold. I'm folding over the ends of my fabric and I'm attaching them together using my glue gun. Once my two pieces of fabric are attached, I'm folding it in half with the seam in the middle, and then I'm attaching the two ends. When I'm done, I'm then folding the fabric over on the two sides, and I'm giving them a hem as well. I'm using my glue gun to attach all my pieces of fabric together, but if you have a sewing machine, that would be a great option too. To give my hat some height, I'm using this tall wired stem. I had it left over from some silk flowers. If you don't have something like this on hand, you can always use a coat hanger. I slipped my wire in between the rubber band, and then I used some hot glue to help hold it in place. To help fill up the top of my hat, I'm using some recycled polyfill, and I'm just hot gluing it around the top of my gnome. I'm using one of the open ends in my fabric to place on the gnome's hat. Once I have the hat on, I'm kind of holding it up a bit while I'm placing my hot glue on the nose, and then I'm just sliding the fabric down to attach it. I'm then adding some hot glue behind the wings, and then tucking my fabric down and attaching it. To fill in the area above the nose, I tucked in a little extra polyfill. Now, just like my unicorn gnome, I'm folding over the fabric and I'm pulling it tightly, and then I'm hot gluing it into place. I'm just continuing to pull the fabric tight and hot glue it into place, and when I'm done, I'll have a seam up the back of my hat. When I was done on the back, I then moved to the front of the hat and I gathered the excess fabric near the top. I folded it over and I began hot gluing it, making a seam just like I had in the back, but this time I followed around my wire. When I was finished, my fabric was completely wrapped around my gnome. I'm using two daisies that I had on hand. I'm removing the centers and I'm placing my antennae, one in each of them. I then added a little hot glue on the back to hold them in place. I decided where I wanted to place them and used my scissors to poke a hole. I then used a little hot glue to help hold them in place. I'm adding a bow to my gnome and I'm actually recycling it off of this old dress. I was so happy when I found it because it actually has a little ladybug on it. I then used my glue gun and I hot glued it to the top of my hat. I also added on an extra daisy accent. I painted another chalkboard tag white, added some hot glue, and attached my gnome to it. When I was done, and to finish up, I added some of these 3D ladybug stickers that I found at Michael's. And with that, my Dollar Tree ladybug gnome is complete. To make my sunflower gnomes, I'm using one of the wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree, and this little gnome comes on a stand. I'm going to give him a base coat, and I'm using some white acrylic paint. I'm actually going to be covering most of him, but I did want to give my gnome some color. When the white has dried, I'm then using some brown acrylic paint, and I'm painting the base. For my gnome's beard, and I always like to try something different, I'm using 2 of these soft white sunflowers, and I picked these up at the Dollar Tree. I removed 2 of the flowers, and because I'm only using the petals, I pulled the flowers apart. On each flower there are 2 sets of petals, and one is just a bit larger than the other. To attach them, I'm adding some hot glue just above the end of the gnome's beard. Now, using one of the larger set of petals, and there's a front and a back, I'm making sure that I'm folding it in half with the front side facing out. I'm now adding on some hot glue just above the folded flowers, folding my next largest in half, and then attaching that into the hot glue. To finish up the beard, I'm once again adding some hot glue just above the folded petals, and now I'm folding my last 2 in half and attaching them. After I added my last flower, I noticed it wouldn't stay folded, so I just added on some hot glue. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a 1-inch wooden bead, and mine has a flat bottom on it, but you can use an assortment of different things for your gnome's nose. I used the same brown acrylic paint as the gnome's base, and I gave it a coat. With the gnome's nose dry, I attached some hot glue in the middle of the top flower and attached the flat end of the nose in place. To make my yellow gnome, I used 2 yellow sunflowers from the Dollar Tree. After I pulled them apart, I attached them onto the gnome the exact same way as the white, painted a nose, and attached that on as well. For the gnome's hats, I'm using a 2.5-inch wired sunflower ribbon, and I picked this up at Hobby Lobby. To get my measurements, I placed the ribbon over the gnome's nose and down each of the sides at an angle, and then used my scissors to cut the ribbon. I added some hot glue to the top of the gnome's nose and attached my ribbon in place. I pulled down each side at an angle and then attached those in place on the back. I'm measuring the next piece of ribbon. I'm slightly overlapping the other, wrapping it around the gnome's head, and then cutting it to size. I added on some hot glue and attached my second ribbon. To add on the top of the gnome's hat, I'm once again measuring my ribbon and cutting it to size. To make the top of the gnome's hat, I folded the center of my ribbon into a point, then folded both sides and the ends under. I added some hot glue to the top and placed on the little cap. Once I had it in place, I then folded over the sides and hot glued it onto the back. The top of the gnome's hat is pretty much freestanding, so to give it a little bend, I just kind of folded it over. For the gnome's arms, I'm using the Dollar Tree burlap ribbon. I measured it across the front of the gnome, and I gave myself about 3 extra inches. I placed the ribbon down flat and added some hot glue about a half an inch or so from the edge, and then folded it over and pressed it together. I made sure to use my finger protector because that hot glue is pretty hot. I then added some hot glue onto the fold and then folded the other edge over it. When I was done, I kind of want to mimic folded hands, so I folded the fabric in half and made a knot. To attach the arms, I centered the knot in the middle of the gnome. I turned it over and I attached the two ends on the back. And when this gnome was complete, I followed the exact same instructions for my yellow gnome. To give my gnomes a flower to hold onto, I'm using one small yellow and one small white sunflower from the Dollar Tree. I added a dot of hot glue on each gnome's knot and slipped in a sunflower. To accent the white gnome's flower, I'm using one of these little felt bumblebees, and I had picked these up a while back on Amazon. This step is completely optional, and I just hot glued the bee onto the center of the sunflower. I'm making a bow for the gnome's hats, and I'm using about an 8-inch piece of the Dollar Tree burlap ribbon. I folded one side into the center and then slightly overlapped the other. I'm using a piece of jute to hold my bow together, so I just pinched it in the middle, wrapped the jute around it, and tied it into a knot. When I was done, I cut off the excess jute and then opened the two loops. Attaching the bow to the gnome's hats is super easy. I just added some hot glue and popped on the bows. I'm giving this gnome feet, and I'm using one of the heart-shaped chalkboard tags from the Dollar Tree. I turned the tag over, and using the same brown acrylic paint, I gave it a coat. With the heart dry and to add on the feet, I placed on some hot glue and then attached my gnome. And for my yellow gnome, I just painted the attached base with the brown paint. And with that, these two sunflower gnomes are complete. To make my fall gnome, I'm using a piece of wood that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. It measures about 10 inches in length and it's about 3/4 of an inch wide. I'm making a mini gnome, so I cut a piece 4 inches in length, and using some white acrylic paint, I gave it a complete coat. Now that the paint is dry, I'm going to make the beard. I'm using this Dollar Tree mop head for my gnome's beard, and I'm cutting off 8 full strands. With them cut, I'm lining one up next to the other. To help attach the beard together, I'm using a white chenille stem, and I'm cutting it in half. I folded my first strand over to find the center. Then, using my glue gun, I placed a line of hot glue right down the middle. I then placed my chenille stem in the glue. From there, I then folded the left strands over the chenille stem and onto the right. This is the beginning of your gnome's beard, and you can leave it like this if you want. I like to open mine up so it's fuller. If you prefer a fuller beard, like I do, all you do, it's super easy, is just gently pull those strands apart. With the beard complete, and to attach it, I'm using my hot glue gun and adding some hot glue in the shape of a smile about an inch down from the top of the wood. I'm then attaching the beard into place. I'm folding the two ends of the chenille stem onto the top and then adding on some hot glue to hold them in place. As you can see, the beard is definitely too long, but this is the fun part. I'm trimming up the sides at an angle and the bottom, making sure that it pretty much is flush with the bottom of the wood. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a wooden bead that I already had on hand, but if you don't have any of these, you can always paint one of the styrofoam vase fillers from the Dollar Tree or one of their pearls. To attach the nose, I'm adding a dot of hot glue on the wood in the center just above the beard and then attaching the nose in place. For the gnome's hat and arms, I'm using this pair of gray baby socks that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. It was basically the only color that I could find that would kind of work with a fall theme. To attach it to the gnome, you want to make sure that the heel is in the back and you're adding on the top part of the sock. And then all I did was just slide it over the top of the gnome's head. To help hold it in place, I lifted up the sock over the gnome's nose and added a dot of hot glue, and then I just replaced the hat. I then added some hot glue on the two sides and pulled the hat down at an angle. I want my gnome's hat to have a bit of height, so I'm using 2 cotton balls, and you can use anything you have on hand, and I'm stuffing them up the back of the hat. To help the hat stand up straight, I added some hot glue to the back, and then I pulled the back of the hat down tightly and held it in place until the hot glue had cooled. To make the gnome's arms, I cut the other gray sock in half so I have 2 equal sides. The outside of the sock is gray, but the inside has a white stripe where they had band them together. So I'm using the inside of the sock because I think it makes a cute accent. I added some hot glue to the top of the sock, and then using my finger protector, I rolled it together tightly. I then added some hot glue on the seam and pinched the fabric together. It's not going to look perfect, but don't worry about it because that uneven, kind of messy edge is going to end up being hidden. With my first arm complete, I followed the same instructions and made the second. I then used my scissors to cut off the uneven ends. To attach both arms, I'm adding some hot glue under the hat, then tucking the end of the arm up under it. I then turn the gnome around and attach the second arm. My gnome's holding a pumpkin, and I found these at the Dollar Tree. There's usually 6. I did use the others for another project. To attach it, I added some hot glue to the end of each hand and then just attached them to the pumpkin. For my gnome's feet, I'm using some of these wooden hearts from the Dollar Tree. They were left over from Valentine's Day, and you can just use any type of little heart that you have on hand. I'm adding some hot glue onto the heart, and I'm using the natural wood color because it matches his nose, and then I'm just placing him on top. I'm adding a really simple accent to his hat, and I'm using some of this white cord that I had on hand. I cut a short piece and then I gathered the top of the gnome's hat into a point. I then wrapped the cord around the hat a couple of times and tied it off in a knot. I snipped off the excess tails, and then using the same cord, I just made a simple bow. I added on a dot of hot glue and then attached it in place. And with that, my mini gnome with a pumpkin is complete. I'm starting my 3 gnome project by recycling 2x4 pieces of wood that I found in my kindling bin. Each piece measures 14 inches in height, and I started my cut at the 6-inch mark on the side, and I continued at an angle until I came to a point. I'm using a piece of sanding screen. I'm just kind of lightly sanding down the edges just to take away any of the rough spots or any splinters, and these don't have to be perfectly cut or shaped. They're just going to be the base for your gnome, and you're really not going to see them. When I was done, I then gave each of them a base coat of white acrylic paint. Now that all 3 pieces have a coat of paint and they're dry, I'm going to start with my lemon gnome. I'm starting my hair or my beard using a Dollar Tree white utility towel. I found this in the automotive section, and I'm folding it over and measuring it against the 6-inch mark on my form. I'm then cutting my towel in half, and I'm making sure to cut off the finished edges. I'm keeping it folded, and then I'm cutting about 1/2-inch strips, leaving myself about a 1-inch border at the top. Once again, these don't have to be perfect. Close enough is just fine. When I'm done, this being a terry cloth towel, there are a bunch of frayed pieces, so I just gave it a good shaking to clean them off. To dye my fabric, I'm going to use some of this inexpensive Dollar Tree coffee, and I'm placing 2 heaping tablespoons into 2 cups of hot water. When I was done, I just placed my towel into my mixture, and I let it set up for an hour. After the hour, I tightly wrung out my towel, and then I placed it on a cookie sheet in my oven at 250 degrees for about 30 minutes. When it was dry, I took a chenille stem, and the color doesn't matter, and then I slid it through the opening on the top where I left the 1-inch uncut fabric. When I was done, I then slid both ends of the fabric to the middle. I then placed some hot glue on the front of my form just before the angled sides. I attached my beard, and then I glued each chenille stem to the side and snipped off the excess. For my nose, I'm using a wooden knob along with this pretty green acrylic paint, but the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree work just as well, and I'm using 2 of those for my next 2 gnomes. With my nose dry, I placed some hot glue on the center of my form and attached my nose into place. For my hat, I'm using one of the fabric lemon placemats from the Dollar Tree. I'm placing it over my gnome's head, so I'm cutting a slice through the backing. When I'm done, I then slide it over my gnome's head. Once I decide where I want it placed, I then trim off some of the fabric, making sure to leave enough to wrap around the back of my hat. I then add a line of glue across the top of my gnome's nose, and I attach my fabric into place. I then add my hot glue to one side of the form, and then pull my fabric down at an angle, and then I follow the exact same instructions and do the same on the other. I tucked a little bit of polyfill under the hat and around the nose to fill out the fabric. This part doesn't look too glamorous, but I'm pulling one side of my fabric and I'm hot gluing it to the back of my form. When I'm done, I then fold the other side of the fabric over and I hot glue it as tightly as I can to the back of the form. From there, I continue to fold my fabric over and hot glue it as tightly as I can against the back of my form. I'm adding a bow accent to the front of the hat, and I found this really pretty lemon ribbon at the Dollar Tree. I'm making a simple bow, and when I'm done, I'm attaching it to the front with my glue gun. To make arms for my gnome, I cut about a 10-inch strip out of the leftover placemat fabric. On the wrong side of the fabric, I ran a bead of hot glue down the center. I then folded one side over and attached it together. I then ran another bead of glue down the center and folded it over, attaching both pieces together. I then folded my fabric strip in half and I cut it in the center. Now that my arms are ready, I'm going to make my lemon flower basket by using one of these candle cups that I had on hand. I used my white acrylic paint and I gave it a coat. Now that the paint has dried, and let me tell you, I'm no artist, I'm going to attempt to pencil on a lemon. Now that I'm done, and it is far from perfect, I'm going to fill in the outline with some yellow acrylic paint. I had a small leaf in my stash and I'm hot gluing it onto my basket. As part of the friend hop, we need to add flowers into our projects, so I'm adding these pretty white and yellow flowers into my basket. With my basket complete, I'm now going to attach the hands. I placed a dot of hot glue on the side and then attached my fabric, folding it over. After I did it on one side, I then did the same on the other. To attach my basket onto the gnome, I'm finding its placement in the center, and then I'm sliding the arms under the hair. Then using my glue gun, I'm hot gluing one arm on each side, and I'm cutting away the excess fabric. To finish up, I gave my gnome a haircut. And with that, my summertime lemon gnome is complete. For my patriotic gnome DIY, I'm using this blue faux fur pillow from the Dollar Tree. And I'm also using their Don't Flip Out red, white, and blue towel. I'm using the pillow as my beard, so I'm separating it from the backing. And I'll also be using the polyfill. To get the measurement for my beard, I placed it against my gnome form and then cut it to size. I then used my glue gun to attach it to my form, making sure that I left a small U shape in the middle where I can attach the nose. For his nose, I'm using one of the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree, and I'm painting it this pretty coral acrylic paint. And I'm actually going to be painting two of them because I'm using one in my next project as well. Now that it's dry, I'm hot gluing it to my form. I'm pulling down the voided area in the beard and attaching it in place. I then added some hot glue on both sides and pulled the beard up around the nose. To make a mustache for my gnome, I cut a 2 by 5 inch piece out of the pillow fur. On the bottom side of the fabric, I added a line of hot glue and then I folded it in half. I then placed a dot of hot glue in the center and then pinched it together. I added some hot glue under the nose and then attached my mustache into place. I then used my scissors to trim it into the shape of a beard. To add the hat, I'm using the striped side of my open towel. I'm placing a line of hot glue over my gnome's nose and then I'm attaching the towel. And just like I did in my first project, I added some hot glue to the side and then I pulled the fabric down at an angle. I laid my towel out flat and then once again I cut away the excess, making sure I had enough to wrap around the gnome. And just like my first project, I used a handful of polyfill to fill out the front of my hat. I turned my gnome over and I added some hot glue to the back, and then I folded over my fabric and attached it into place. I added a bead of hot glue on the folded area and then folded over my next piece of fabric. I then added some hot glue on the other side, folded my fabric over and attached that into place. Just like my first project, I continued adding hot glue and folding over the fabric as tight as possible until my end was folded into a point. To embellish my hat, I'm using 3 pieces of this pretty red, white, and blue star ribbon that I found at Michael's. I measured and cut all 3 pieces, and then I hot glued them to the hat. I'm giving my gnome some arms, and I'm using the same matching ribbon. I'm folding over the ribbon, and then I'm tying the end into a knot. I then cut off the extra end. I tried it up against my gnome, and I decided how long I wanted his arm to be. I then made a second arm for the other side. When I was done, I then added some hot glue to each arm, and I folded it in half. To attach my arms, I used my hot glue gun and placed them at the beginning of the hat line. I made my gnome a little flower flag basket to hold, just like I did in my first project. I took the basket and I slid it over my gnome's hands, and then using my glue gun, I attached the 2 hands together. To embellish my hat, I had this clear plastic star on hand. I painted it red and I attached it to the front of my hat. I found this package of sparkly stars at Michael's, and I attached a white and a blue one onto my star. To bring in the summer flowers, I'm adding some Dollar Tree flowers to the top of my gnome's hat. I didn't have a planned out pattern where I was going to attach them. I just started hot gluing them on here and there until I filled out the top of the hat. I finished up my gnome by adding 1 additional flower onto his hat and a little accent bow to the side. And now my patriotic gnome is complete. I'm starting my gnome by using this faux hair that I picked up at Michael's. I'm measuring the beard against the form, just like I did in my last project, and then I'm cutting it to size. I hot glued it into place, once again leaving an opening for the nose. When I was done, I then hot glued my nose into place. And just like in my last project, I hot glued the sides of the beard up around the nose. I'm using some random Dollar Tree flowers that I had left over from previous projects, and I'm starting to hot glue them onto my gnome's hat. I continued on adding my flowers here and there until I had the gnome's entire hat covered. After all my flowers were in place, I then added in some green leaves to give it that country gnome vibe. With my gnome's hat complete, I'm now giving his beard a little trim. I gave my gnome a mustache by pulling apart a little bit of the hair and twisting it to the side. To finish up, I'm using these 2 bumblebees that I found at Michael's, and I'm attaching one onto the gnome's hat and the other onto his beard. And with that, my summertime gnome is complete. For the base of my bunny gnome, I'm using one of these children's hats that I found at the Dollar Tree. It has these cute little palms on the top, and I'm actually removing one and using the other as the bunny's tail. To help my gnome stand up, I'm tracing a small bowl onto a heavy piece of cardboard. When I was done, I then cut it out, making sure that it fit in the bottom part of the hat. Now that I have it in place, I'm going to use some recycled polyfill and stuff the hat. Using my glue gun, I'm adding some to each side and I'm kind of folding over the fabric just to make the top a bit smaller. To make the beard for my gnome, I'm using some strands from this Dollar Tree mop head. I'm going to cut off 20, but depending on the size you want your beard, you can always use a few more or a few less. Now that they're cut, I'm lying them side by side and trying to keep the ends as even as possible. Attaching them together, I'm using a white chenille stem, but any color will work just fine. I'm placing a line of hot glue down the center and then placing on the chenille stem. When I'm done, I'm then folding the left mop strands over the chenille stem and onto the right. When I'm done, this is what my beard will look like. You can use it as is if you like. I like my beard to be a bit fuller, so I'm going to open each of the mop head strands. Now that my beard is open, I'm going to trim up the sides and just kind of clean it up a bit. To add it to my gnome, I'm placing it on the front and tucking the chenille stems down inside. I'm adding some hot glue to the body and then attaching the beard. For my gnome's nose, I'm using one of the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree, and to make it easy to paint, I'm sliding one end onto a wooden skewer. Now using my coral acrylic paint, I'm giving it a complete coat. When it's dry, I'm using my glue gun and attaching it to the gnome just above the beard. Once it's in place, I then use my glue gun and attach both sides of the beard around the nose. I'm using this pretty blue Dollar Tree hat for my gnome, and it has this little dinosaur on it. I cannot get it off, so I'm just going to turn the hat around and use the back. I want to make it a bit fuller, so I'm just going to add a handful of polyfill inside. Now that I'm done, I'm just slipping it over the gnome's head. I'm then placing a line of hot glue on the gnome's nose and attaching the hat. When I'm done, I'm then attaching the two sides and the back. To make the bunny ears, I'm using a piece of the Dollar Tree microfiber pad. I'm cutting it in the center, making sure not to cut any of the back stitching, and I'm making both sides about 2 inches wide. They're pretty messy, so I'm cleaning off as much of the fibers as I can. To give them the appearance of bunny ears, I'm using my scissors and I'm rounding off one end. To help hold down some of those flyaway fibers, I give mine a coat of hairspray on the back and the two sides. Adding the bunny ears to the gnome is super easy. I'm placing each one under the cuff of the hat. Once they're in place, I'm adding some hot glue to the hat and then under the cuff. To add a bit of highlight to my bunny's ears, I placed a bit of blush on the end of a cotton swab and then accented the center of both ears. I'm making my bunny gnome a simple bow, and I'm using this pretty Easter egg ribbon that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. When I was done, I then cut both ends at an angle. I added some hot glue in between the bunny's ears, and then I attached my bow. As an extra accent, I have this sweet little daisy, and I'm adding it onto the bow. The hat has a natural point to it, so I just squeezed the two ends in and it stayed in place. To hide the dinosaur in the back, I cut a short piece of the microfiber pad and then I just hot glued it into place. And when I was done, this large gnome bunny is ready for Easter. I'm starting by using one of these fluffy dust mops from the Dollar Tree. To remove the handle, I just twisted it off the end. With that complete, I'm placing it aside to make Santa's boots. I'm using one of these cute little boot ornaments that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I'm removing the little pom-pom accents, and I'm going to hang on to those because sometime in the future I'll probably end up using them. Now, using my scissors, I'm going to carefully remove the white faux fur from the top of each boot. I'm not going to be using the bottom part, so if you have to sacrifice a bit of that, not to worry. I removed the bottom and the glue that held on the top. It came off pretty easily. When I was done, I then followed the same instructions for the second boot. Each of the boots have a seam, so I'm using a light grit sandpaper and lightly sanding them down. I wiped off the sanded residue, and now using my black acrylic paint, I'm giving them each a coat. Now that they're dry, I'm going to attach the faux fur rings back on the top. I placed it back over the boot and then used my glue gun to attach it in place. After the first boot was complete, I followed the same instructions for the second. When you're adding it back on, don't worry if it's not perfect because honestly, you're not even going to see most of it. With both of them complete, I'm adding some hot glue to the top front to attach them together. On the opposite end of the dust mop, from where I removed the handle, there is a small capped end. To attach the duster, I'm adding some hot glue in the center of the boots, between the fur, and placing the end down to meet the bottom fur on the boots. To give my Santa some weight so he can stand on his own, I'm using some of these glass beads that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I pushed as many as I could down into his boots, and you can always use anything you have on hand. Now that he's balanced and stands on his own, I'm removing the top metal piece that attached the handle. To give my Santa just a bit more support, I'm using 2 of the 6-inch wooden dowels that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. To help them blend into Santa's beard, I gave each of them a coat of white acrylic paint. To attach them, I'm placing one in the back of each of Santa's boots and making sure that they touch the bottom. I'm then adding some hot glue between the dowel and the boot to hold them in place. I'm now pulling away the beard and adding a dot of hot glue to the dowel, and then I'm hiding it back into the beard. When I was done, I then followed the same instructions for the other side. To add on Santa's hat and his arms, I'm using one of the red sparkly Christmas tree skirts that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. To make Santa's hat, I'm giving myself enough room on the side of the skirt, placing the top at the top of his head, and then wrapping it around. I'm making sure I have enough fabric to cover his head, and I'm basically cutting the skirt in half. Before I add it, I need to make his nose, so I'm using one of these table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. I'm painting mine with some coral acrylic paint, and to make it easier to paint, I'm placing one of the Dollar Tree wooden skewers into the side of the ball. Once it's dry, because it is paint on plastic, it can scrape off, so I'm giving mine a coat of Mod Podge to help protect the finish. When it was dry, I added some hot glue to the center of the beard 5 inches up from the bottom of the boots. I then pushed Santa's nose in place. I have my Santa upside down so you can see where I'm placing some hot glue on the top of his nose. To attach his hat, I'm first centering the fabric and placing the white end of the fur on his nose. I now folded down the top, added some hot glue, and then attached that to the top of the head. I'm now gathering the fabric in my hands and I'm bending the top slightly to the side. I'll be using one of these Dollar Tree dust cloths, but first I'm turning Santa over and I'm using it to protect his nose. I'm adding some hot glue along the top edge of the faux fur and I'm folding it in half. And now I'm doing the same for the other side. I'm attaching some hot glue to the back of Santa's head and then attaching my first folded side. I'm going to make an almost point at the top of Santa's hat. I folded it over and then hot glued it to the other side of Santa's hat. I'm now adding hot glue as I'm working my way down and I'm pulling one side of the hat tightly onto the other, but not too tightly. You want to make sure that the front of Santa's face isn't constricted by how tight the hat is. And if you're not sure, before you glue it together, just kind of play with it so you're comfortable when you glue it. And as you can see, I also used my finger protector just to help prevent getting burned. To make Santa's arms, I'm using the other side of the tree skirt. I'm turning it over and folding one side about an inch worth of fabric. Now using my glue gun, I'm attaching the folded piece to the other side. I'm now adding on some more hot glue and folding my fabric onto that. I'm now giving myself about a ½ inch edge and cutting it free from the tree skirt. I'm adding a line of hot glue down the middle of the arm and folding the edge of my fabric onto it. With this one complete, I follow the same instructions and make my second arm. I used my scissors and I cut off those pointy ends. To attach them onto my Santa, I placed some hot glue on the top part of the arm and then tucked it up under the side of Santa's hat. I attached Santa's right arm the same way, but I let it hang just a bit lower than his left. My Santa's going to be holding a little gift box, and I'm using one of the gold presents from the Dollar Tree. I used some hot glue to attach the gift to his arm and to his beard. You can always leave his hat as is, but for me, I wanted to make it a bit fluffier, so I'm using that Dollar Tree dusting mop pad. There are seam lines in the back, and I'm going to cut along 2 of those, one completely and one halfway. One piece won't wrap completely around Santa's hat, so I'm going to end up using a piece and a half. Attaching them is super easy. I added some hot glue onto the white of Santa's hat, and then I centered and placed down the white fur. I added some hot glue onto the sides and the back, and then I attached my second piece. To accent Santa's hat, I'm using a piece of holly on a red ribbon, and this came off a Dollar Tree pick, but you can use any type of holly that you like. To attach it, I placed a dot of hot glue onto his hat and then just placed down the holly. To finish off Santa's hat, I'm using a white pom-pom that I already had on hand, but if you don't have any, a cotton ball will do the trick. Then I simply attached it in place with some hot glue. I was looking at Santa's boots and they looked a bit dull to me, so I ended up giving both of them a coat of my Mod Podge. When they were dry, they were nice and shiny, and now this Santa is ready for the holidays. I'm starting my unicorn gnome with a woman's cotton ankle sock along with 2 jars of the vanilla bath salts, and these all came from the Dollar Tree. The easiest way to fill your sock is to slide it over the mouth of the jar. And each of these are 17.6 ounces, and I like to use about 1.5. When I'm done, I just kind of wiggle around the salt in the sock, and then I tie off the end with a rubber band. To cover my gnome's body, I found this cute 2-pack of socks at the Dollar Tree, and I'm using one of the striped ones to cover over my white sock. Then, using my scissors, I'm cutting down the end of my white sock, and I'm just tying it into a knot. All this does is just help the elastic band keep everything in place. To make my beard for the gnome, I'm using one of these multicolor pom-pom keychains. They're from the Dollar Tree, and I'm removing the hanger, and then using my scissors, there's a thread inside that's kind of holding it all together. I just cut that away, and then I open up the pom. Before I attach my beard to the gnome, I'm using my scissors to kind of even off the sides, and I'm giving it a semi-rounded shape. When I'm done, I'm adding some hot glue, and I'm making sure not to add some at the very top because this is where I'll be tucking in my nose. To give my gnome some arms, I'm using the other matching sock, and I'm cutting it right down the center. I now have 2 pieces, and I'm folding one in half, and I'm measuring it against my gnome to decide about how long I want my arms to be. Once I'm done, I then cut them both to size. I'm folding my socks inside out, and I'm matching up the 2 sides. I'm then using my glue gun, and I'm sealing the 2 sides together. I'm adding some arms onto my gnome, but this step is completely optional. Once they're all glued together, I then turn each of them inside out. I'm then adding a dot of glue to the closed end, and I'm attaching them both together. I'm then centering my hands in the middle of the beard, and I'm hot gluing an arm to each side. To make the nose for my gnome, I'm using one of these table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree, but you can always use a plastic ornament, or you can even use one of these wooden knobs. For my nose color, I'm using this pretty coral acrylic paint. To help keep my hands a little cleaner, I just poke a hole in the back of the ball, slide in a skewer, and then give it a good coat of paint. When my nose is dry, I'm adding some hot glue onto the body and attaching the nose. Once it's attached in place, I'm then hot gluing the sides of the beard up and around the nose and onto the body. With that complete, and to make the horn for my unicorn, I'm using one of these unicorn skirts, and I picked this up at the Dollar Tree. I'm removing the stitching from the waistband and on the back seam so that I end up having one long piece of fabric. I'm then folding it in half and matching up my 2 ends, and then cutting it on the fold. There are some imperfections in the fabric, so I folded over the long ends, and then using my iron, I gave each of them a seam. To add my 2 pieces of fabric together, I just placed the top piece over the bottom, and then using my glue gun, I attached them both together. I turned my fabric over, and I placed one corner into the center, and then I met it with the other corner. When I was done, I then attached both pieces together. With my hat all put together, I'm now using some polyfill, and I'm going to stuff the end. Now that it's stuffed, and to make the horn, I'm folding one side into the center, and I'm attaching it with my glue gun. When my first side is attached, I'm then doing the same with my second, and once again, I'm folding it into the center and attaching it with my hot glue. With my first two pieces attached, I'm then working my way up and continuing to gather and hot glue the fabric together until I come to a point. Now that my hat's all glued together and you can see I have the seam in the back, I'm now going to slide it over the top of my gnome. I'm placing a line of hot glue on the nose and then I'm attaching the bottom of the hat. With my nose in place, I now pulled the sides of the fabric down and attached it, making sure that I covered where I had placed the arms. When I was done, I added a little more filling around the nose just to kind of fill out that area on the hat. With my hat in place, I'm once again gathering the fabric on the back and I'm pulling it as tight as possible. And once again, I'm hot gluing the fabric together and I'm making another seam. When I'm done, my fabric has been pulled together tightly and I have my seam on the back. To wrap my horn, I'm going to be using some clear fishing line, but if you don't have any of this on hand, you can always use some dental floss or some rubber bands. I cut a long piece of fishing line and then I tied it around about 3/4 of the way down on my hat. I tied about 3 or 4 knots in my fishing line. I then started wrapping the line tightly around the fabric and turning it into a point. When I came to the end, I once again tied off my fishing line with 3 or 4 knots. With my unicorn horn complete, I want to give my gnome a flower laurel. For my base, I'm using 6 chenille stems and I'm going to wrap them together in 3s. I found the measurement for my gnome's head and then I wrapped my stems into a circle. I'm using an assortment of leftover flowers and leaves that I've had on hand, and all I'm doing is just starting to randomly glue them around the circle. As I'm adding them on, I don't have any special placement or pattern. I'm just kind of gluing them on here and there to fill around the ring. When my laurel is finally complete, I then place it over my unicorn gnome's head. To give my gnome some feet, I'm using one of these chalkboard tags from the Dollar Tree and I'm painting it the same color coral as I did his nose. I added on some hot glue and then placed my gnome right on top. I gave him a little mustache and with that, my unicorn gnome is complete. I'm starting my Halloween witch gnome by using one of the white socks from this Dollar Tree 3-pack. I also picked up a pair of witch socks at the Dollar Tree, but you can use any kind of socks for this project. For the base of my witch, I'm just recycling this old plastic pasta jar, and you can use anything for this project. I just washed it out really well, and I'm going to remove the label. To prevent the container from tipping over and giving it some stability, you'll need to add something heavy to it, and I had picked these glass beads up at the Dollar Tree a while ago, so I'm going to add these in to give it weight. You can use anything you have on hand, even some rocks that you'll see I used in my next project. With that complete, I'm now using one of the white Dollar Tree socks and I'm just sliding it over my container. I'm then taking one of the witch socks and I'm sliding it over the white sock. And the reason I'm doing this is it just prevents any see-through basically on the front of your witch. Once I have it in place, I'm then going to cut down the center of the witch sock and tie it into a couple of knots. For the witch's hat, I'm kind of cheating a little bit and I'm not making it from scratch. I found this cute ghost at the Dollar Tree and the hat is the perfect size, so I'm just removing it from the fabric to use on my witch. The hat's made of felt and it did not want to release from the back part of the fabric, so I just used my scissors to cut it free. I then removed the ribbon, the hang tag, and the little hanger on the top. I still have a little piece of the white fabric attached to the hat, but that'll be hidden later when I put the witch together. Attaching the hat to the base is super easy. I'm just adding some hot glue and then placing the hat over the knots. To give my witch some hair, I'm going to use some of this creepy cloth from the Dollar Tree. You'll also need a pipe cleaner or chenille stem, and any color will work. I measured the cloth just under the hat and to the bottom of the base to get an idea of how long I wanted her hair to be. From there, I folded the fabric in half to roughly the correct length, and then I just cut a piece of it out. I then opened my creepy cloth, lying it flat, and I placed the chenille stem in the center, and then I just pushed the fabric together and gathered it at one end. I then just continued cutting the cloth and gathering it under the chenille stem. And don't worry if your ends are lining up perfectly, because when we're done, we're going to give the witch a haircut. To attach it all in place, I'm then adding some hot glue to the top of the chenille stem and then folding the creepy cloth over it. To add her hair to the base, I'm adding some glue just under the edge of the hat on the back, and I'm attaching it into place. I then continued adding the hot glue under the hat and just working my way around with her hair. When I came to the front, I just twisted my two chenille stems together and kind of tucked them up against the hat, but depending on the size of your container, you can just snip them off. I know what you're thinking, this looks like one hot mess, but I'm just going to use my scissors and give her a haircut, and she cleans up pretty nice. I'm making a Halloween tutu for my witch, and I'm starting off with a piece of Dollar Tree jute, large enough to wrap around the base and tie off in the back. For her skirt, I'm using this pretty sparkly orange Dollar Tree tulle along with some plain black tulle. I'm not measuring out my tulle, and I'm cutting the black in about 2-inch wide pieces. I'm cutting my orange tulle at about 1 inch wide each, but if it's a little larger or a little smaller, not to worry because it won't matter. To put the tutu together, I'm starting with 2 pieces of the black tulle. I'm folding them both in half so I have a little loop on the top. I'm then placing my tulle under the jute and sliding the 2 little tails through the loop. Once it's pulled tightly against the jute, I'm now moving on to the orange tulle. I'm only using 1 piece of orange, and this is a little trickier because it's shorter in length, but I'm just following the same instructions. I'm folding it in half, having the little loop on the top. I'm placing it under my jute, sliding through the tails, and then pulling it tightly against the black tulle. I'm using 2 pieces of the black tulle and only 1 of the orange because the black tulle is much thinner. So when I originally just tried 1 piece, it didn't really show up too well. So that's why I ended up using 2. I continued adding my black and orange tulle until the tutu was complete. When I'm done, I'm then using my scissors to trim away any of the uneven ends. Attaching it to the witch is super easy. I just wrapped it around her waist and I tied it tightly in the back. I then cut off the extra jute ends and used some hot glue to hold the tutu in place. To make her nose, I'm using one of the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. To make it easier to paint, I like to pop a small hole in the back of the ball with my skewer. I'm then using this pretty green acrylic paint, and I'm going to end up giving it 2 coats. Once it's dry, I then add on some hot glue and attach it under the witch's hat. I then added some hot glue to the top of the witch's nose, and I attached her hat to that. This step is completely optional. I'm going to be adding 2 ponytails to her hair, and I'm just cutting a small section of the cloth. I cut off 2 pieces of black ribbon, and then I tied a piece of her hair on both sides. I'm making my ponytails this way, but you can tie your ribbon directly on, and that will work great too. Once they were both tied off, I then used this cute orange polka dot ribbon that I found at Michael's, and I made 2 simple bows. I then used my glue gun to attach both where I tied off the hair. To add on some arms, I'm using the other witch sock. I cut it about halfway to the heel, and then I cut it in half. On the inside of the sock, I added a line of hot glue, and I attached the 2 sides together. I waited for them to cool, and then I turned them inside out. Then, using my glue gun, I attached some glue to the underneath part of the arm, and then attached them to the witch's body. What's a witch without her broom? So I'm adding one of these long-handled brooms that I found at the Dollar Tree. It was a bit long, so I cut it down to size, and then I attached it between her 2 hands. To hide the glue on her hat, I'm using a piece of this Dollar Tree witch ribbon, and I'm just wrapping it around and cutting it to size. The ribbon is wired, so I'm folding each side to the center and then attaching them together with my glue gun. And then I'm attaching the ribbon to the hat. This next step is completely optional. I just wanted to give my witch a bit more of a spooky vibe. I'm cutting a piece of black tulle to wrap around the hat, and then I'm tying it and I'm gluing it into place. I made a bow out of the same black tulle and then hot glued that into the back center of her hat. Then to finish up, I'm using 3 of the spider rings from the Dollar Tree, and I'm just cutting off the plastic ring part. Then, using my glue gun, I'm attaching all 3 to her hat. To give her a quick pair of shoes, I'm using one of these wooden chalkboard heart tags from the Dollar Tree. I added some hot glue to the center and then placed my witch right on top. And with that, my Dollar Tree Halloween witch in a tutu is complete. I'm starting my gnome by using a 5-inch pumpkin from the Dollar Tree. I removed the tag and noticed it wasn't standing up perfectly straight and it was kind of leaning to one side. So I used my kitchen knife and I gave the pumpkin a flat bottom. To give the pumpkin a little more stability, I'm using 3 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. Using my glue gun, I attached the 3 sides of the blocks together. Once they were all attached, I then added some hot glue onto the base and then centered my pumpkin. To cover the gnome's body and to make the arms, I'm using 2 of these gray kid socks from the Dollar Tree. So I used my first gray sock and I just slid it up and over the pumpkin. Then to help hold the sock in place, I cut down the center top and then tied it into a knot. To add the beard on my gnome, I'm using a white Dollar Tree bar cloth. To hold the beard together, I'm using a white chenille stem. I'm starting at the corner of the bar cloth and I'm cutting off the finished edge. I'm cutting off the bottom trim at 9 inches and the side at 8. When I'm done, I'm then folding that piece of fabric in half and cutting it free. I'm now opening my fabric up, and on the folded line, I'm adding a bead of hot glue. And now I'm placing that white chenille stem right on top of it. With that in place, I'm folding the fabric over and pressing it together. Now carefully, while the glue is still hot, I'm sliding each side of the fabric into the center of the chenille stem. Once it's gathered and you're done, it kind of looks like a little skirt. To mimic the hair, I used my scissors and cut thin strips in the fabric. While I was cutting them, I wasn't super fussy, but I did try to keep the strands about the same width. And I cut the two pieces of fabric together up until I met the chenille stem. With my beard complete, I'm adding it to the gnome about 2 to 3 inches down from the top, and I'm wrapping the chenille stems around the sides and then twisting them together on the back. I then added some hot glue under the chenille stems to help hold the beard in place. With his beard attached in place, I'm now going to trim it up using my scissors. I cut the two sides at an angle and trimmed around the bottom of the beard. My scissors are really sharp, but I did have to work a bit to get through the folded towel. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a wooden bead that I had on hand. It's a medium size, and sometimes I paint them, but I like the natural color, so I'm just going to leave this one as is. To attach it, I'm placing a dot of hot glue in the center of the beard just above the chenille stem and then attaching the bead in place. For my gnome's hat, I'm using a black sock from the men's department at Dollar Tree. I made sure that the heel section on the sock was on the back, and then I slipped the sock over the gnome's head. I then pulled each of the sides down next to the beard. To attach the sock to my gnome, I pulled back the fabric over the nose, added on a line of hot glue, and then attached the fabric back in place. I'm going to be adding on some arms, so I'm attaching the hat, working my way about an inch or so back from the beard. I added on some hot glue and attached both sides at an angle. To fill out my gnome's hat and give it a little bit of body, I'm using a handful of polyfill. I stuffed it up under the back of the hat and filled out about 4 inches or so. This step is completely optional. You can always just leave the hat as is. To make the gnome's arms, I'm using the second gray sock from the pair. I opened the sock up, I laid it flat and cut directly down the center. The inside of the sock are going to be the outside of my arms because there's a little decorative edge where they had sewn the socks together. When I was done, I then cut off the toe part and left myself about 4 inches of sock. I added a line of hot glue on one side and folded the fabric over. I then added on more hot glue and continued to fold the fabric over, adding hot glue until I rolled the fabric so it looked kind of like an arm. When my first one was complete, I then made my second. As you're rolling the fabric, the ends become uneven, so I ended up cutting them straight off at about the 4-inch mark. To attach them, I pulled up the side of the hat next to the beard and added on some hot glue. I then placed down the arm and pulled the hat over the end. With my first arm in place, I then attached the second. I'm going to have my gnome hold a small apple, and I found one on a fall Dollar Tree pick. I removed it, added some hot glue to the gnome's hand, and pressed it in place. I then added some hot glue to the other hand and pressed it against the apple. To give my gnome some easy feet, I'm using one of the heart-shaped chalkboard tags that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue and then pressed down the gnome. To embellish his hat, I'm using some of this farmhouse ribbon that I picked up at Michael's. They do sell it at Dollar Tree. I couldn't find it at mine, and I'm wrapping it around the gnome's hat and then making a bow. Once I had it the right size, I then trimmed off the tails. I'm adding on a red leaf and a berry pick from the Dollar Tree. I added on some hot glue where the top of the hat folds over and attached the leaf, and then I added on the berries. And now that I'm done, I'm adding on one more of the small Dollar Tree fall leaves and tucking it up under the red leaf and attaching it in place. To finish up, I'm folding over the end of the sock using the same buffalo check ribbon. I'm tying it off into a simple bow. Now that I'm done, this sweet little gnome holding an apple is ready for my tiered tray. To make my springtime gnome, I'm using one of these wooden gnome cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I'm adding on a beard, so I just slid my butter knife under the hands and the butterfly to remove them. I'm now removing the little piece of burlap, and the gnome's nose is attached to it, so that's coming off too. I removed the hanger, and I'm giving the front a coat of white acrylic paint. I'm painting the gnome's shoes a different color, so I'm leaving those blank. Using the same white acrylic paint, I painted the butterfly in the center of the hands. For the gnome's hands and boots, I'm using some of my gray acrylic paint. And once again, I'm giving each a coat. For the butterfly in the center of the hands, I'm using this large pink one, and I picked this package up at Michael's. I actually got it on clearance for 90 cents at the end of the season, and sometimes you can find them at the Dollar Tree. To attach it, I placed some hot glue on the back of the body and centered it between the hands. I then added some hot glue to the top of each of the wings to help hold them in place. For my gnome's beard, I'm using one of these hanging gnomes from the Dollar Tree, and the beard is glued on, so I just kind of pulled at it and it came off pretty easily. I cut away the pink pom-pom nose, and I'll save that for a project in the future. The end of the beard is kind of scraggly, so I used my scissors to clean it up. To attach the beard, I'm first placing down some hot glue on the body and then attaching it so that the boots will show on the bottom. I want to fluff the gnome's hat out just a bit, so I'm using a handful of polyfill. I added some hot glue to the top of the gnome's head and then placed down the polyfill. To add on my gnome's hat, I'm using one of these pink knit caps that I found at the Dollar Tree. I folded down the side with the embroidery, turned it around, and I'm going to be working on the back. To add it onto my gnome, I simply slid it over its head. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a 1.5-inch wooden bead, but you can always use one of the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. I'm giving my gnome's nose a coat of coral acrylic paint. Now that it's dry, I'm adding some hot glue to the center of the beard, just under the edge of the hat. I added a line of hot glue across the nose and placed down the edge. With that in place, I'm now turning the gnome over and attaching the back of the hat. I need to tighten the hat up just a bit, so I'm adding a little bit of hot glue to one side and folding the fabric over. I'm then following the same instructions for the other side. I'm continuing to work my way up both sides of the hat by adding on some hot glue and folding the fabric over. By the time I make it to the top, I've folded both of the sides into a point. Before I attach the hands to the gnome, I'm going to add on a little accent with my colored yellow pencil. I'm outlining both of the gnome's boots with my pencil and then rubbing it in with my fingers. With those complete, I'm moving on and following the same instructions for the hands. The reason I'm using a yellow pencil is because I'm adding on 2 daisy accents and the center of those are yellow, so this kind of pulls it all together. I'm now placing these to the side and I'm going to add an accent onto my gnome's hat. I'm using some of this crochet thread that I had on hand. It's a little bit thinner than yarn, but you can use yarn, ribbon, jute, anything you'd like. I made sure to cut a piece long enough to wrap around my hat. I attached the end of the thread onto the back top point of the hat using my glue gun. I then started wrapping it around at a slight angle, making sure to keep the same spacing between each section. When I came to the end, I turned it over, snipped off the excess string, and then hot glued the end in place. I also added some hot glue onto each string in the back just to help hold them in place. I added on some hot glue, attaching the hands and making sure that I centered the butterfly under the gnome's nose. I'm adding on 2 daisy accents, and these came from the Dollar Tree. I added some hot glue to the back of each, attached one near the gnome's nose and the other at the top of the hat. I'm going to make a stand for my gnome, and I'm using 12 of the tumbling tower blocks. If you'd prefer yours to hang, just add a piece of jute or ribbon onto the back. I'm using my glue gun and I'm attaching together 2 stacks of 6. And because these don't have to be perfect, because they're going to be on the back, I'm using my glue gun instead of my Starbond thick glue. I'm giving both sets of blocks a coat of white acrylic paint. Now that they're dry, I'm adding some hot glue to the back of each boot and pressing on the stands. Now that I'm done, this cute little gnome is ready for spring. For this project, I'm duping a gnome-shaped pillow. I'm starting by using 2 of the Dollar Tree snowflake knit hats, and I actually bought them at separate times, and the weird thing is, one came with a pom-pom and one didn't. Before I get started, I'm removing the tags and the pom-pom, and I won't be using it for this project. I want my gnome to stand up, so I'm using a piece of cardboard, and this is just the insert from a frozen pizza. And then I'm using this little bowl that's about the size of the top of the hat. And then I'm simply tracing it with my pen and then cutting it out with my scissors. Now that I have it cut out, I'm just going to try it in the bottom of the hat to make sure that it fits. I'm then popping it out and adding some hot glue to the inside top of the hat. And then I'm just placing the cardboard back into place. To fill my pillow, I'm using some polyfill that I had in my stash, but you can use anything that you have on hand. And now it's super easy. You just stuff the pillow to whatever size you'd like. When I'm done, and to help keep the filling in the hat, I'm using my glue gun, and I'm just kind of folding over one side of the hat and I'm gluing it into place. And after I do it on one side, I then do the exact same thing on the other. To add on my beard and my nose, I'm using one of the gnome stockings from the Dollar Tree. It pulls apart really easy, and then I'm just going to cut away the fabric from the top of the beard and the nose. I actually used one of these and made a gnome pillow, and I'll have that video linked below in case you'd like to check it out. So now that the beard's removed, I'm going to carefully cut off his nose. Now that they're in two pieces, I'm going to place the beard against the pillow, having the bottom part of the beard be flush with the bottom part of the pillow. Then, using my glue gun, I'm just attaching the beard into place. I'm now making my gnome's hat, and I'm making sure the snowflake is centered on the front. And I'm going to add in just about a handful of polyfill and kind of push it up to the top. Now, making sure that I'm keeping the snowflake in the front, I'm just placing the hat over my gnome. I pulled my hat down on both sides and the back, and then I used my hot glue gun to attach them into place. I then took the nose, tucked it up under the hat, used my hot glue gun to attach it to the beard, and then I placed a little on the top of the nose and attached it to the hat. And now I'm turning him around, and I'm tucking in some of the hat fabric, and then I'm adding a bit of hot glue to kind of turn it into a point. When I was done, I then just kind of folded the hat over, and I'm adding on this pretty green pom-pom from the Dollar Tree as his final accent. I removed it from the keychain and just simply hot glued it to the top of his hat. My dupe is slightly different than the Pottery Barn's, but I think he is so cute. Sven, the gnome pillow, is sold out on Pottery Barn, but his friends are going anywhere from $60 to $70. He is currently selling on eBay for $155 and $175, and he only cost me $4 to make. I'm starting my gnome by using one of the white woman's Dollar Tree crew socks, and I'm actually going to be using two for this project. You can fill your socks with just about anything, but I like to use bath salts, so I'm using this 17.6 ounce container from the Dollar Tree, and mine is a eucalyptus mint, and it smells really, really good. To fill it, I just slip the end of the sock over the mouth of the jar. To help hold the salt in place, I'm using an elastic band and I'm tying off the end of the sock. With that in place, I'm cutting down the top center of the sock and I'm just tying it in half. Here's where my second sock comes into play. I'm simply sliding it over my first. The reason I'm doing this is because some of the small particles of bath salts can actually filter their way out through the fabric. For my gnome's beard, I'm using one of these fluffy purple keychains that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I'm using my scissors to cut away the hanger and then the string inside that holds it all together. So once in a while you actually have to kind of trim up the pom-pom, but this one seems to have a pretty good shape, so I'm just going to attach it onto my sock. I added some hot glue onto the front of my sock, making sure not to place anywhere I'm going to be adding the nose, and then I just attached the beard. And once again, I just cut down the center of the top of the sock and I just tied it in half. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a large wooden bead that I had in my stash. It's a little over an inch, but you can always use one of the Dollar Tree table tennis balls. For the feet, I'm using one of these wooden hearts that I picked up at the Dollar Tree around Valentine's Day, but if you don't have any of these on hand, you can always use one of the Dollar Tree chalkboard tag hearts. I'm painting both of mine with some coral acrylic paint, but that's just personal preference. You can choose any color at all. With my nose dry, I'm pulling back the beard, I'm adding a dot of hot glue, and then I'm attaching the nose in place. Once that was in place, I then glued both sides of the beards around the nose. For my gnome's hat, I wanted to use an Easter sock, but my Dollar Tree never got any in. So I'm going to be using this woman's sock that I found at the Dollar Tree, and it kind of reminds me of Easter eggs. I'm making sure the heel is on the back of my sock, and then on the open end, I'm tucking it in about 4 inches or so. I'm placing it over my gnome's head, and the easiest way to do this is to really stretch out the end of the sock. I pulled it tightly over the nose and the sides and the back, and then I cuffed about 2 inches of the inside fabric that I had originally tucked inside the sock. By doing this, I'm making a little pocket for both of the ears to sit in. To keep my hat in place, I added a line of hot glue over the top of my gnome's nose. I turned my gnome around and attached the back of the hat, and then I attached both of the sides. I'm going to be tying off the end of the sock where you can see there's a little bit of a white toe section, and I'm using some of this pretty polka dot ribbon that I found at the Dollar Tree. I cut a length of the ribbon and I just wrapped it around where the white end of the sock was, and then I just tied it into a simple bow. To finish it off, I just trimmed off the ends of the ribbon. To add on the ears, I'm using some leftover pieces that I had from the Dollar Tree microfiber dusting pads. When I turn the pad around, you can see where the lines are sewn onto the back. I'm then cutting about 2 inches from the outside next to the sewn lines, and I'm making sure that I don't cut through them. I'm cutting the same size piece on the other side, and once again, I'm making sure that I don't cut through the sewn fabric. These pieces are pretty messy, and I'm just pulling off all the loose fibers. When I'm done, I'm then using my scissors and I'm rounding off the top of each. To help control the shedding, I use hairspray and I just give it a coat on both sides. When I'm done, I'm matching both tops of the ears together, and then I'm cutting the bottoms off even. With both my ears complete, I'm now tucking the ends of them into the cuff that I made on the hat. I then used my glue gun, added some hot glue to the back of the hat, and attached the ears in place. I'm attaching the gnome's feet by placing some hot glue on the top of my painted heart and then placing down the gnome. To make his arms, I'm cutting a strip out of the microfiber cloth, making sure that it's long enough to wrap around his beard and onto the sides. When I was done, I cleaned off all the little fibers, and then using my glue gun, I attached an arm on one side and then the other. My gnome bunny is going to be carrying an armful of carrots, and I found these felt stickers at the Dollar Tree. I removed the little sticker from the back, and then I tucked it into my gnome's arms. I use these felt stickers, but you can have your bunny hold just about anything. This step is completely optional. I added a little blush to the end of a cotton swab, and then I just accented the bunny's ears. To add on the cottontail, I actually removed this pom-pom from the top of a Dollar Tree hat, and I'm just adding some hot glue to the back of my gnome and attaching the tail. And with that, this bunny gnome is ready to hop into spring. For my Frankenstein gnome, I'm using one of these felt treat bags, and I actually found these at Dollar General. But you can find similar bags at Dollar Tree and Family Dollar. I'm removing the drawstring from the bag, and then I'm turning it inside out. I then used my seam ripper and removed only the bottom stitches from the bag. I then turned the bag to the correct size, and I added a dot of hot glue on each seam to prevent it from coming loose. To fill in the top of Frankenstein's head, a Dollar Tree ribbon spool works perfect, so I'm measuring one and cutting it out of some cardboard. When I was done, I then used some of the Dollar Tree black acrylic paint and I gave it a coat. I then used my glue gun and attached it to the inside of his head. To make his body, I'm going to use one of the white Dollar Tree socks, and I'm trying to use some of the things that I already have on hand, so I'm using this bag of Dollar Tree white stones. I just scooped them up and filled up my sock. When I'm done, I'm then adding an elastic band to hold the rocks in place. And to give it a little extra strength, I'm using the black cord from the bag and tying that on as well. I'm recycling this black and white sock from the Dollar Tree and I'm just sliding it over my white sock. I'm then cutting and tying the ends into a knot. To add on Frankenstein's head, I'm just sliding it over the top, and I'm also adding on his nose. This time I painted a wooden knob with my coral acrylic paint and I'm just gluing it into place. I then added some hot glue on the top and attached his head. To make his beard, I'm using one of these black Dollar Tree pom-poms. I removed the tags and the hardware and then used my scissors to open it up. I then gave it a little bit of a trim so that it kind of resembled a beard. I then used my glue gun to attach it to his face, making sure that I tucked the beard right up under his nose. When I was done, I then glued his head to the back of his body. I'm using some black ribbon that I had on hand to meet the black circle that's on his head. I wrapped it around his head, cut it to size, and then hot glued it into place. My ribbon is a little bit taller than his head, so I just used my scissors to snip off the excess. When I'm done, to hide the green that's showing, I'm just using my black paint and giving it a coat. To make the bolts for his neck, I'm using these two wooden clothespins and I'm cutting them to about an inch or so in size, and then I'm painting them with my gray acrylic paint. Once they're dry, I'm then hot gluing them to the side of his neck. For his arms, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree skeletons, and I'm just removing it from the elbow down. I'm then painting the arms black and the hands green with my black and green acrylic paint. With both of them dry, I'm using the same black acrylic paint, and I'm going to give him some fingernails. To add them on, I'm just adding some hot glue to the inside of the arms and attaching them to the body. I'm using 2 of these tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree as his shoes, and then the third one I'm using to balance his bottom. I added some hot glue to the end of each block, and then I just placed him on top. I then placed some hot glue on the last block and tucked it under his bottom to balance him off. To give him that creepy Halloween vibe, I'm then adding on one of the green spiders from the Dollar Tree. And when I'm done, my Halloween Frankenstein gnome is complete. Getting started on my Valentine's Day gnome, I'm using a plastic 12-inch funnel, and I picked this up in the automotive department at the Dollar Tree. After removing the label, I'm using one of the children's white athletic socks from the Dollar Tree, and I'm placing it over the end of the funnel. To hold it in place, I'm adding on some hot glue and attaching the top of the sock to the funnel. While you're attaching it, don't worry if it's not perfect because it's only meant to cover the bottom of the funnel. For my gnome's beard, I'm using this pink and white duster cloth, and I found this in the cleaning department at the Dollar Tree. Along with the duster, it comes with a plastic handle, but I put that aside because I won't be using it for this project. I opened up the back to the flat piece of fabric, and I'm adding on some hot glue. I'm now adding it on against the sock and making sure that the bottom of the duster matches up with the bottom of the funnel. For my gnome's nose, I'm using a 1.5-inch wooden knob. I had this on hand, but you can always use one of the Dollar Tree table tennis balls. I'm painting mine with some coral acrylic paint, and to make it easier to paint, there's a small hole in the bottom of the knob, so I'm just placing in a wooden skewer. Now that it's dry, I'm adding it onto my gnome, and using my hot glue gun, I'm attaching it about 1/3 down from the top of the duster. To make my gnome's hat and to cover the body, I'm using this pink and white knee sock, and I found this at the Dollar Tree. It has a little love design at the top, so I'm going to be cutting that off. Now that I have my 2 pieces, I'm placing the shorter sock with the love over the base of my gnome's body. And I tuck the front of the sock up and under the beard. I'm now adding on the longer sock as the hat, but before I do, I'm placing a handful of polyfill inside. I'm now adding it onto the gnome, and I'm placing it over the funnel. I'm making sure that the heel of the sock is on the back and opposite from the gnome's beard. With that in place, I'm now attaching the end of the sock onto the gnome's nose. I placed a line of hot glue on the top of the nose and then attached the end of the sock. To attach both the sides, I'm making sure to leave enough room for my arms, and then I'm just adding some hot glue on the side of the gnome and pulling down the hat. And after one side's complete, I then move on to the second and follow the same instructions. With the sides in place, I then attach the back of the hat by simply adding some hot glue and pulling down the sock. When I was done to close up the sock opening on the bottom, I just added in some hot glue. To make the heel on the sock not quite so noticeable, I'm just adding in some hot glue and sealing it shut. For my gnome's arms, I'm using 2 of these pink striped socks, and I found this set in the baby department at the Dollar Tree. To make my arms, I'm first lying the socks flat with the heel on the bottom. To make the arms, I'm first adding a line of hot glue on one side of the sock and rolling it. I'm then adding a line of hot glue next to the rolled edge, and I'm rolling it again. From there, I keep adding on my hot glue and rolling the sock until I come to the end. Now that my 2 arms are complete, the toe end of the sock, it makes your gnome look like he has mitten hands. So those will be showing in the front, and the other end will be tucking under the hat. I'm tucking one of the arms on the side, up and under the hat. I'm then turning my gnome over and tucking in the second arm. I made sure they were both the same length, and now using my glue gun, I'm attaching them in place. If you like making gnomes, I've made a whole bunch of them using Dollar Tree supplies, and I'll have that playlist linked below in my description in case you'd like to check it out. I'm adding on some simple accents, and I'm using this pretty heart ribbon. It's 5/8 inch, and I picked it up at the Dollar Tree. I cut a short piece, and I'm wrapping it around the end of my gnome's hat to kind of make a little ball. I then used my scissors to cut off the extra ribbon. I'm using the same ribbon, and I'm just making a simple bow to add to the front. When my bow was finished, I used my scissors and I cut off both tails at an angle. Adding it was super easy. I just placed a dot of hot glue on the front of my gnome's hat and popped it into place. I'm giving the top of my gnome's hat a little bend, so I added on some hot glue, folded it over, and held it in place. I made a smaller bow out of the same ribbon, and I attached it just above the ball on the end of the hat. For my gnome's feet, I'm using one of these wooden hearts from the Dollar Tree, and I'm giving it a coat of red acrylic paint. With the red heart now dry, I'm turning it around, adding on some hot glue, and placing down my gnome. I'm having my gnome hold a love sign, and I found this pack at the Dollar Tree. I added a small dot of hot glue to each hand, and then attached the love. As my final accent for my Valentine's Day gnome, I'm using one of these small red sparkly hearts from the Dollar Tree. And all I did was add a dot of hot glue in the center of the bow and attach it. And with that, this sweet gnome is ready for Valentine's Day. To start my floppy-eared Easter Bunny gnome, I'm recycling a can of Pringles potato chips, and this isn't the large container or the small, it's the medium size, and I think it's about 14.5 ounces. To give my container a little weight, I'm using a handful of these glass beads. They sell them at the Dollar Tree, or you can use some sand or some rocks or anything that you have on hand. I placed mine in the container and then just snapped on the lid. With that done, I'm using some white acrylic paint and I'm giving the base of the container a coat. When it's dry, I'm going to be using one of these white quarter socks from the Dollar Tree. And all I'm doing is simply sliding it over the base for my bunny. To give my base a little shape, I'm using a handful of polyfill and I'm just going to kind of tuck it around the top of the can. Now that I have it in place, I'm using my glue gun and tacking down the edge of the sock onto the top base of the bunny. For my gnome's beard, I'm using this pink pom-pom that I picked up at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just removing the hanger and the thread inside that holds it together. And surprise, surprise, I found a little white pom-pom inside, so I'm going to end up using this for my bunny's tail. I'm using my scissors and I'm just cleaning up the edges of the pom-pom and giving it a bit of a rounded shape. I'm now adding some hot glue to the bottom of the base, making sure that I leave an area for the nose and then attaching the beard into place. For the gnome's nose, you can use one of the table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. I'm using one of these wooden beads that I had on hand, and mine measures a bit larger than an inch in diameter. If you're using the table tennis ball, an easy way to paint it is to just slide it onto the end of a wooden skewer. I'm painting my gnome's nose with this parchment acrylic paint, but you can choose any color that you'd like. With my gnome's nose dry, I'm adding some hot glue to the front, just under the beard, and attaching it into place. Now once again, using my glue gun, I'm attaching the sides of the beard up around the nose. I'm using one of these diabetic crew socks from the Dollar Tree, but you can choose any color that you'd like. Using my ruler, I'm cutting 4 inches up from the toe. I'm using my scissors and I'm cutting down the center of the sock to just about where it begins on the heel. I'm then tucking the raw end of the sock in about 2 inches. Now, keeping the end of the sock tucked under, I'm slipping it over my gnome's head. And while I'm doing this, I'm making sure that the cut line is centered over the nose. I'm adding some hot glue to my gnome's nose and attaching the front of the hat. I then turned my gnome around, added on some hot glue, and attached the back of the hat. I'm turning the 2 cut pieces of socks into bunny ears. I folded the 2 pieces of fabric together and then I cut them away at an angle. After I did it to my first, I followed the same instructions and did it to my second. To hide the hole in the top of my hat, I'm just tying the ears in half. I then tucked a few small pieces of polyfill under the hat to give it a little more height. When I was done, I then hot glued the 2 sides of the hat down. To hide the fold in the fabric on top of the hat, I pulled 4 flowers off of this Dollar Tree stem. I then added some hot glue to the top and popped the flowers into place. I'm using this pretty Easter egg ribbon that I found at the Dollar Tree, and I'm just making a simple bow for the front. I cut the ends at an angle, and then using my hot glue gun, I attached it to the front of the gnome. To add the arms to the bunny, I'm cutting about a 1-inch piece from the toe fabric. I'm cutting one end in the loop, and for some reason, this fabric, it turns itself inside out, but it looks kind of fuzzy like a bunny, so I'm just going to tie a knot in the center. I'm using a small basket that I had on hand, and I'm adding in some of the small Dollar Tree vase fillers to make it look like Easter eggs. When I was done, to add the basket to the bunny's hands, I just simply slipped it on. Then to attach it to my gnome, I centered the basket under the nose and attached an arm on each side. For my gnome's feet, I'm using one of these wooden hearts that I picked up at the Dollar Tree, but if you can't find any of these, the chalkboard wooden tags will work just as well. I decided to paint my gnome's feet yellow, but just about any color would look great. When the feet had dried, I just added some hot glue to the top and then placed down the gnome. To finish up, I'm going to hot glue that pom-pom to the back of my gnome bunny. And with that, this gnome Easter bunny is complete. To start my Halloween cat gnome, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree tubular gift boxes, and I'm only using the bottom half. I'm using a black sock that I already had on hand, and I'm sliding it over the bottom part of the gift box. To give it some stability so it won't tip over easily, I'm using some rocks that I picked up outside in my yard, and I'm popping them right inside the box. To help secure the end, I'm using a rubber band, and then just like my last project, I'm going to cut down the center of the socks and tie them into a knot. To make my gnome's beard, I'm using one of the mop heads from the Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting off 16 strands. I've used the Dollar Tree mop heads for some of my other gnomes, and I have that playlist linked below in case you'd like to check it out. Once I have them all cut, I'm just lining one right up next to the other. You'll need a chenille stem, and you can use any color you have on hand. To attach my beard together, I'm running a line of hot glue right down the center of the mop strands. I'm placing my chenille stem in the glue and then folding one side of the strands over to the other. This part is super easy. All you need to do is just start unraveling each of the mop strands. When you're done, you'll have this really cute beard, and what I like to do is just take my scissors and kind of shape it into a triangle. With my beard complete, I'm trying it up against the cat's body to decide where I want to place it, and then I'm attaching it with my glue gun. I'll be tucking the chenille stems under the cat's hat. I painted an orange nose, just like my witch's nose, and using my hot glue gun, I attached it just above the beard. For the gnome's hat, I'm going to use this black kid's hat from the Dollar Tree, and I tried like crazy to get that little patch off, but it was really attached on there. So I ended up just leaving it, and I folded the flap down on the hat. I then pulled it over the gnome's head and kind of positioned it over his nose and around the beard. Once I had it in place, I then added some hot glue to the top of the nose and attached the hat. I then added some hot glue to the back and attached the hat in place. To turn my gnome into a cat, I'm using the pieces from this Dollar Tree Halloween costume set. I removed the ears from the headband, and then I removed the little inserts that were pink from the ears. I painted them with the same orange acrylic paint to match the nose and glued them back in place. The ears are a little wider than I want them, so I'm just kind of folding that fuzzy fabric between them and hot gluing it together. I'm now attaching them to the hat by adding some hot glue onto the back of the ears and then just placing them against the hat. I cut away the elastic that came with the bow tie, and then I attached the bow tie in the middle of the ears. I'm using that elastic band, and I'm measuring it up against the cat's nose for whiskers, and once I decide on the size, I'm then cutting out 6. If you like the whiskers long and you find you don't have enough, not to worry because it also comes on the tail. With my whiskers all cut, I'm adding some hot glue next to the nose and then just tucking 3 on each side. To make the hat into a point, I'm gluing down each side and I'm pulling them a bit tight at an angle. On the back of the hat, I'm attaching the excess hat fabric together with my glue gun. So basically what I'm doing is I'm adding hot glue and I'm pulling the 2 sides together and I'm working my way up until the top of the hat ends up in a point. I've been making these type of hats for a long time, so I kind of know where to put my fingers so I don't get burned, and if you haven't done this before, definitely pop on a finger protector. If you don't want to try this with hot glue, you can always use a needle and thread, and that'll work great too. I have my point, but also glue residue. I'm just brushing on some black acrylic paint and it basically disappears. I'm once again using some of those Dollar Tree spider rings. I'm cutting off the ring part and then attaching one onto the beard and one onto the top of the hat. To add the tail to my cat gnome, I'm adding some hot glue onto the back and then attaching the tail. I'm using the candy corn mice from a past video, and I'll have that linked below. And with that, my Halloween gnome cat is ready to display. To make my carrot gnome, I'm starting with one of these Dollar Tree cylinder boxes. And if you don't have any of these on hand, you can always use a Pringles can. I need to weigh the box down, so I'm just using an assortment of these glass beads that I had on hand. You can find them at the Dollar Tree, or you can use some rocks or sand or anything you'd like. Now that I'm done, I'm replacing the cap and I'm turning it upside down. I'll be using 2 of the white kids' crew socks from the Dollar Tree, but for right now, I'm going to be placing one over the cylinder. Once I'm done, I'm then removing the top part of the container, and I'm going to just save it for another project. For my gnome's beard, I'm actually going to use the beard off of this Dollar Tree bunny gnome. It's glued on and it comes off pretty easily. If you can't find one of these bunny gnomes, I've actually made a bunch of Dollar Tree gnomes and I've used some different things for the beards. And I'll link that video below so that will give you some ideas if you can't find this bunny. I decided where I wanted to place it and then just attached it with my glue gun. I made sure when I was attaching the beard that I left room to place the nose so I didn't attach it completely on. To make the gnome's nose, you can actually use one of these table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. I'm going to use this wooden knob that I had on hand, and they measure about 1 inch in diameter. I'm painting mine with some parchment acrylic paint, but you can paint yours any color you'd like. To attach the nose, I pulled down the beard just a bit and then hot glued it into place. Once the nose was attached, I then glued the beard around it. For the gnome's hat, you can find felt and you can find fabric at the Dollar Tree. I'm using this piece of orange fabric that I already had on hand. It measures 36 by 20 and I'm folding it in half so it will measure 18 by 20. I'm making the hat by first adding some hot glue to the bridge of the gnome's nose. I'm then centering my fabric and attaching the folded edge onto the nose. I then turned my gnome around and I folded over one end of the fabric. I added on some hot glue. I pulled it down tightly, making sure it was snug on one side of the gnome. I'm now turning my gnome around and once again I'm folding over the edge of the fabric and then I'm attaching it over the last piece that I just attached. Once I turned him around, he looks like he needs a mustache, so I just clipped a tiny piece from the side of his beard. And I'll be adding that on later. I'm now attaching the 2 folded ends in the back together with my glue gun. So you now basically have an orange tube on the gnome's head, and all I'm doing is stuffing it with some polyfill. I added just enough to fill out the gnome's hat, but not too much so that I couldn't close it. I'm now using my glue gun and adding some to the top of the gnome's hat, and then I'm just folding over the edges to give it a nice, neat hem. I'm also using my Dollar Tree finger protector so I don't get burned. To make the gnome's hat turn into a carrot, I'm folding the fabric over on the back and then adding some hot glue to hold it into place. I've made a bunch of Dollar Tree gnomes with similar hats, and I'll have that video linked below in case you'd like to check them out. When you're done, turn the hat around, and if it's not quite tight enough, not a problem. You just turn it back over, fold the fabric a little tighter, and then once again, hot glue that into place. While I'm closing the carrot up, I didn't close off the top completely because I wasn't sure if I was going to possibly add some greenery popping out of the top. I wanted to mimic those lines that you see on a carrot, so I'm just using my pencil and I'm making some small short lines here and there around the hat. I decided at this point that I wasn't going to add any greenery to the top, but that's just personal preference. You can add some greenery in, and I just closed up the point the exact same way I had closed up the back. This gnome's beard looks just a little messy to me, so before I add on the mustache, I'm going to give it a little trim. I'm now adding on the gnome's mustache from that little piece of beard that I cut off earlier, and I'm using my glue gun to attach it. To make my gnome's hand, I'm using my second crew sock. I turned it over and I cut just below the heel. I then, using my scissors, cut down the center of the sock. To make the hands, I'm folding the outside end of the sock over and attaching it to the inside. And now I'm using my glue gun to glue both sides of the sock into the center. So when you're done, the outside of the hands will be the smooth side of the sock. Now that I have a set of arms, I'm cutting off the ends to make them even. Adding the arms to the gnome is super easy. I just placed the side of the arm against the gnome, making sure that the hand was centered under the nose. I then attached the arm to the gnome and tucked the end under the hat. I then turned the gnome around and did the exact same thing on the other side. I then added a little hot glue between the hands and pressed them together. I always like my gnomes to be holding something, and I found these felt carrot stickers at the Dollar Tree, so I'm just adding 3 of them into the gnome's hands. I didn't remove the sticky back, I just slipped him into his arms. I'm going to give his hat a little accent, and I found this really cute carrot ribbon at the Dollar Tree, and all I'm doing is making a simple bow. When I was done, I added a dot of hot glue onto the back of the bow and then attached it to the gnome's hat. Then, to add a little hint of spring, I added a daisy to the center of the bow. I'm going to make some feet for my gnome, and this step is completely optional. I'm using a leftover wooden Dollar Tree heart, and I'm giving it a coat of green acrylic paint. Now that it's dry, I'm adding some hot glue to the top of the heart and simply placing down the gnome. And with that, this carrot gnome is now complete. To make my gnome in a flower pot, I'm using an ankle sock from the Dollar Tree along with another jar of bath salts. Once my sock is filled, I'm then tying the top off once again with a rubber band. To make the beard for this gnome, I'm using some strands from a Dollar Tree mop head. I like a full beard, so I cut away 16 strands, but you can make your beard any size you'd like. When I was done, I lined them all up. To hold my beard together, I placed a line of glue through the center of my strands and then placed a chenille stem right on top of the glue. Once I was done, I then folded the mop strands from one side over the chenille stem and onto the other. I then cut 5 more of the mop head strands. This time I placed a line of hot glue just beyond the chenille stem and then attached my strands. My idea is to make a flower child gnome or a hippie, and I'm hoping this will end up being his long goatee. With everything attached, I'm now unraveling my gnome's beard. Once I'm done, I'm then giving the gnome's beard a trim, and I didn't unravel the 5 long pieces because I didn't want to accidentally cut them in the process. While I was shaping it, I just used my scissors and I kind of cut shorter on the sides and left it longer on the bottom. When I was done, I then unraveled my 5 long strands. And I'm just leaving them as is until after I attach the beard. Attaching the beard is super easy. I cut off the excess chenille stems. I decided about where I wanted my beard to be and I just placed it against the gnome's body. I painted a yellow table tennis ball just like I did in my last video, and I attached it onto the gnome's body with some hot glue. I then used some hot glue to attach the beard permanently in place. I tucked it up under the nose, and then I attached the 2 pieces to the sides. I'm going to be braiding my long pieces, so I took a rubber band and I wrapped it up just about where the beard begins. And then I separated my strands into 3 equal sections. Then I just braided them together. When I was done, I wrapped a rubber band around the bottom to hold my braid in place, and then I snipped away the one that was in the beard. I made a simple bow from some ribbon that matched my hat, and this also came from the Dollar Tree. When I was done, I added a dot of hot glue and I attached it over the yellow band. For the gnome's hat, I'm using one of these striped socks from the Dollar Tree, and I'm stuffing it with some polyfill. You can make your hat any size you'd like. I'm going to stuff mine to just about the heel. Once I'm done, I then slide it over the top of the gnome. I then add a line of glue along the top of the nose and then pull my hat right down on top of it. Once it's set up and in place, I then pull the sides down and attach those to the gnome's body. I then finished up attaching it to the back. To embellish the hat, I cut 4 long thin ribbons and I'm just tying them around the top. I'm then using some pip berries from the Dollar Tree and I'm just wrapping a few strands around the middle of the hat. These are the things I'm adding onto my gnome, but you can add on anything you like and personalize it your own way. I'm using 2 flower pots for this project. I painted one from the Dollar Tree a pretty yellow, and this small one I found at Michael's. I painted this one white. When they were dry, and to give them a little accent, I used the 3 colors, the yellow, the aqua, and the white, and I added some random dots on each of them. I used the back of my paintbrush, I placed it in the paint, and then I made some dots. When I was done adding my dots to the pots, I then added some yellow dots onto my bow. I'm attaching the little flower pot to the front of my gnome's hat. What's a flower pot without some flowers? So using my hot glue gun, I attached a little piece of Sahara inside. I'm using some of the same little flowers that I used in my first project. They're just random and I've had them left over. I'm cutting off the stems and I'm just placing them inside of the pot. When I was done, I had this cute little flower pot full of flowers. I then added some hot glue onto my hat and just placed the flower pot into it. To finish up, I placed my gnome in the flower pot, and then using some of those same random flowers, I just tucked them all around him. I added 3 yellow flowers to his beard. I tied off my top ribbons into a bow. I added a yellow sprig of flowers, and with that, my flower child gnome is complete. Here we are at the end of the video, and if you've made it this far, that is so awesome, and I hope you enjoyed making these gnomes with me. If you're new to my channel and you're thinking after almost 2.5 hours that you'd like to come back and hang out with me again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I'll leave more home decor inspiration for you at the end of this video, and I hope you all have an amazing day, and I will see you soon. Bye, everybody!